If you've got your Bibles with you, you might like to turn back to that passage we read a little earlier. As we think of Elijah, this mighty character, man of God, surely one of the most mysterious characters in the Old Testament, and maybe a favorite of yours, as I'm sure as he is of mine. His arrival is sudden. We know little about him. Very few details. And we're given a warning of his entrance here. He just appears in the middle of this passage. It's a bit like one of those classic westerns, isn't it? You know, where the drifter comes in and sorts all the problems out in a kind of Clint Eastwood sort of character, and then drifts off again into the sunset. Well, maybe not quite like that, but you get that kind of feeling of you don't really know him, and yet when he comes, what a difference he makes to the situation as it is, and it is desperate here, isn't it? And of course, once his work is complete, his departure is dramatic and glorious as he goes in a whirlwind and a chariot of fire, not seeing death. Well, we might speculate on why we know so little about Elijah, but God has his reasons, and we may never fully know. What we do know, however, is that Israel, at the point of Elijah's appearance, was in a desperate state. And it's really hard to exaggerate that. So let's consider, before Elijah comes on the scene, something of the background. On the wider background, we have, of course, in the book of Kings, it commences with the final days of David and the accession of Solomon, his son. Even that wasn't straightforward, as you might know if you know the passage. But Solomon then becomes the next king, and the kingdom then really expands. It goes into its golden age of Israel. Never has the kingdom been at that point so wonderful. And that glorious beginning comes because Solomon asks for wisdom. And God grants him that wisdom, but he gives him all the other treasures as well. And it's a high point in the kingdom of Israel. There is much of God's blessing as the kingdom extends, it's fortified, it becomes known throughout the world then. Those who visit, like the Queen of Sheba, come and are amazed at what Solomon can do and his wisdom and so on. And then perhaps again the high point is the building of the temple. David wanted to do it, but Solomon is given that opportunity because David was a man of blood, and it is Solomon who's going to build this magnificent temple. But there's a downside too, isn't there? As we come into chapter 11, Solomon loses his way, he declines, his death comes, resulting in the splitting of the kingdom. Though he was wise, he had his weaknesses, and he sought foreign wives who introduced other religions in, and so this once magnificent kingdom starts to crumble. There is this split. Remember the two characters in this, Jeroboam and Rehoboam, which can be quite confusing as to which one was which. Someone the other day gave me a helpful reminder. Rehoboam was the righteous one. He was the rightful king. He wasn't a righteous person, but he had the rightful place. Jeroboam was the one God judged. He was the one that caused the split and ended up with the kingdom being in two kingdoms, effectively. Judah and Benjamin, that became collectively known as Judah, and of course the other 10 tribes, which became collectively known as Israel. And Rehoboam remained king of the smaller Judah, and Jeroboam, the first king of this new kingdom. Both kingdoms suffered in many ways. Neither were perfectly following the Lord, although Israel, the 10 kingdoms, were in a far worse state than Judah. And a whole succession of kings come, where there's disaster, bloodshed, intrigue, assassination. And we read of that if you glance over chapter 16, this is where we see it happening. Most of them all seem to be away from God and rebelling from God. They follow their great original leader, Jeroboam. And it seems as each king comes, the situation gets worse and worse. And we hear of, he was the worst king. And then the next one comes along and he was even worse. Until we come down to verse 29 where Ahab reigns after his father Omri. And it is a desperate place. The kingdom has sunk so low. New gods have been introduced. The center of worship is now Samaria in that kingdom. And all kinds of foreign gods have come in. They could not be further than that. All these kings were regarded as wicked. And yet when we come to Ahab, he's described as the worst yet. So that's something of the background. And then we have this man Elijah comes in on the scene. Let's just read what it says again. In the 38th year of Asa, he was the king of Judah, and he was a good king by and large. Ahab became the king of Israel, son of Omri. Listen to what he says. He reigned over Israel and Samaria for 22 years. And Ahab, the son of Omri, did evil in the sight of the Lord more than all who were before him. And as if it had been a light thing for him to walk in the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, he took for his wife Jezebel, one of the most infamous names we have in the Old Testament. This foreign queen who seemed to, in effect, rule the kingdom more than Ahab. He comes across as rather a weakling. She seems to be ruling more, and more destruction comes because, of course, she brings in foreign gods. We read here that he erected an altar for Baal in the house of Baal, which he built in Samaria, the new center of worship. And Ahab made an Asherah pole, and Ahab did more to provoke the Lord. Dreadful thing to have said of you. He did more to provoke the Lord, the God of Israel, to anger than all the kings of Israel who were before him. And they were pretty bad themselves. Then we have this little incident at the end, don't we? In his days, Hiel of Bethel built Jericho. Now the significance of this, of course, is if you cast your minds back to Joshua, when Jericho was defeated and destroyed, it was not to be rebuilt. It was God's will that it was not to be rebuilt. And this man, Hiel, rebuilds Jericho. And look at what it says. He laid its foundation at the cost of Ibrahim, his firstborn. Can you imagine that? Well, you'd think he'd stop then, wouldn't you? But he set up the gates at the cost of his youngest son, Higab. And so, whilst Ahab himself didn't actually get involved in this building, he gave permission for it. He oversaw it. He didn't stop this man doing it. That was the kind of man that King Ahab was. He did, it seems, everything to bring anger and the wrath of God on him. He'd become king out of a faction. That's another story. We see that in 1 Kings 16, 21 to 27. His capital was now Samaria. Continued with idolatry. He sinned more than those before him. Jezebel as his wife, a Baal worshipper, and as they say, he seems to permit these things that God had expressly commanded not to. What a situation. What a state to come to. And so, with this deliberate and willful disobedience, that is the state of the kingdom. How gracious of God to come to this kingdom in that state. He didn't wipe it away and say, well, that's it, you've gone too far now. But he sent Elijah. to do business there, to speak on his behalf. You know, the picture is pretty awful, isn't it? It's not so very different to the state of the world we've got today, and throughout the ages we've got to this point, haven't we? Look at our society. It's pretty corrupt, inefficient leaders, mass idolatry, not the same form, but if you look at the way people are worshipped celebrities and the way in which social media has controlled so many people, and the way our laws are being changed in this land, it's not so different, is it? It is a hopeless situation. But as God sent a man there, I believe God can do the same thing again here. Maybe not in quite the same way as Elijah, but God raises up people to serve him. All through history, we have this great account. You were hearing about it on Wednesdays in times of revival. So we have the arrival of Elijah. There's no fanfare or sound of him coming. He's just there, isn't he? And he starts to tell this king some home truths. So let's look at chapter 17, verses 1 to 7. We see Elijah's person. We see Elijah's power. We see Elijah's preservation and Elijah's predicament at the end. Let's look at them each in turn. What do we know about Elijah? Well, not a lot. Elijah means Jehovah is my God. It's a great start, most significant name in a time of apostasy like this. He's from Tishbe in Gilead. There's some dispute by the scholars as to exactly where this location was, somewhere east of the Jordan River, which would probably be now somewhere in present-day Jordan. We don't know exactly where it was. It may have been part of the territory of Manasseh, one of the tribes, or it might have been possibly in Naphtali, which borders Manasseh, or it could have been perhaps somewhere between them. It was considered a rather rough region, an outside place. So he was very much an outsider coming to the king's court. We don't know exactly how he got to be there and present himself to the king in this way. But his God was able to do such things. What was his occupation prior to his call? We don't know. We could only speculate. But we know he was something of an outsider, and yet he gains this access to the palace of Ahab. So God quite clearly raised this man for such desperate times. It's interesting, isn't it? God sometimes uses well-known people of their day, sometimes unknown and obscure, often that way. Think of Elijah, this unknown outsider, compared to, say, someone like Isaiah, who was very much a court man, cultured, and very much part of the Jerusalem scene. Or think of Peter and Paul. Peter, just a fisherman in a small town backwoods by the Lake of Galilee. Compared to Paul, who was trained by Gamaliel, who was a Roman citizen, who had status and authority. God can use either, can't he? Isn't that wonderful to know that? He's not dependent on our position and our gifting and our background. He can use anyone. God can use you. God can use me. The question is, are we willing? So that's something about Elijah's person, which, of course, we know very little about. But what is most extraordinary in the story of Elijah, and you'll see it more as the story unfolds in later chapters, was Elijah's power. Or was it Elijah's power? Well, in one sense it was, wasn't it? It was through him, but of course we know it was God's power, really. Look at what he says. Elijah, he just arrives on this scene and he says to Ahab, "As the Lord, the God of Israel, lives before whom I serve, I stand. There shall be neither dew nor rain these years, except by my word." power was invested in this outsider, this nobody, that he could speak to a king in that way. It reminds us that God can raise a man or a woman and use them in such a way. We're used today to having these great people around us, the kind of Elon Musks. They are the power makers, the influencers on social media, tycoons, celebrities that seem to have so much influence over people. They can fill stadiums. They can have people running after them. But can any of them have power where they could say there won't be rain for 3.5 years? And notice, not just that there won't be any rain, there wouldn't be any dew on the ground until I say so. Was that Elijah's power? Well, no. It was God working through Elijah, enabling him to say those things. It was extraordinary, wasn't it? What was Elijah's secret? That this power should come through him, that he could stop the rain, alter the weather, and have the power to bring it back. And we see more of this power being displayed through Elijah as the story progresses. We can't look at these things, but remember a little later on, he is taken to a widow. She has nothing. She's preparing to die, but he enables this oil in her lamp to continue so that she would not run out. And the raising of her son when he dies. And then the great event on Mount Carmel when all those prophets of Baal are arranged against him. And there is Elijah standing alone. And everyone else watching. What will happen? Who is the God who could answer by fire? And Elijah knows his God will do it. But to make the case, he even gets water to be poured on the altar, so it's sopping wet. And then he prays. Down comes the fire from heaven. A great victory. What amazing power that God was able to channel through Elijah. He is, in a way, he was like a magnifying glass. You know, if you've got a magnifying glass, you may remember as a child, I wouldn't advise it to do it now, but there's the risk of fires. But you know how you can set a little bit of paper alight by training the beam of the sun through the magnifying glass. Well, Elijah was a bit like that, wasn't he? God was able to concentrate his power through Elijah. What a powerful man he was. And yet, we're told he was just a man. He wasn't a superhero. He didn't have these powers in himself like some kind of Superman. He was ordinary. Look at what it says in James. And this is amazing when you think that he could hold the rain from coming. And yet we're told in James these things about prayer, in the context of prayer, and Elijah himself. Verse 17 of chapter 5. Elijah was a man with a nature like ours. He was just like us. He had all the weaknesses, all the inconsistencies, all the failings and the faults. In fact, in the book of Kings a little later, we know he comes to that point where he despairs and he wants to die. And that was just shortly after this great experience on Mount Carmel, where he saw God light the fire. And then he's fearful of this woman Jezebel, and he runs and he sits under a tree and he says, I've had it. I want to die. He was a man just like us. Elijah was a man with nature like ours. He prayed fervently that it might not rain, and for 3 years and 6 months it did not rain on the earth. Then he prayed again, and the heaven gave rain, and the earth bore its fruit. What a man. What a man of prayer. And yet, just like us. So, what is the secret? Well, Quite clearly, not only had God called this man for this specific purpose, but Elijah in some way must have been close to God, walking with him. He wasn't sinless, but he was walking with God in such a way that God knew he could use him as a channel for his power to go through. How we need to pray for all of us really, but especially for preachers, for pastors, for missionaries and people in particularly prominent positions with the gospel. Pray for them that they will have this almost Elijah-like quality. Of course, we're not going to reproduce an Elijah again. God works in different ways and different means. But for something of the spirit of Elijah. Do you remember when Elisha saw Elijah go up in a chariot and he struck the river with Elijah's staff? He said, "Where now is the God of Elijah?" And we ought to be praying that. Where is the God of Elijah? We don't want Elijah again. There's no point in Elijah coming back. But we want the God of Elijah, don't we? We want to see something of that measure of his coming and helping us, that we might be more effective, we might be better people. Elijah then has made this challenge. He's thrown down the gauntlet to this king. This was an outrageous thing to do, to go before a king and to put him in this embarrassing situation in front of all his courtiers, in front of Jezebel. And so he was in great danger, but Elijah is preserved. And the word of the Lord came to him, "Depart from here and turn eastward and hide yourself by the brook Cherith, which is east of the Jordan. You shall drink from the brook, and I have commanded the ravens to feed you there." So he went and did according to the word of the Lord. He went and lived by the brook Cherith, that is east of the Jordan. And the ravens brought him bread and meat in the morning, and bread and meat in the evening, and he drank from the brook. There is the miraculous in this. The Lord takes him away. He puts him in this place where he would be safe and hidden. It's a way of escape, and he provides for him in a most wonderful way, miraculously. Remember, there's a drought beginning, and yet the brook at this stage hasn't dried up. I'm guessing it would have been up somewhere in the mountains or the hills, where it would still be a fresh source bubbling away before it went down into the valleys, and so he could drink that. But where did the meat and the bread come from? I remember one preacher once mischievously saying, perhaps the meat was taken from Jezebel's kitchen. Well, we can only speculate on that. But ravens. Now, we know from Leviticus 11:14 that raven was an unclean bird, and yet it was the ravens that brought him bread and meat. What stopped the ravens from eating the meat? It's a miracle here. Where did it come from? Well, with God is no problem, is it? He provided bread and meat in the wilderness when Moses and the children of Israel were in need of food, with the manna and then later the quail. Maybe it was something of that kind, I don't know. But all we know is that he was sustained all that time. How come they didn't find him? Again, God was preserving him. God was surrounding him. God made it in some way impossible for them to discover where he was. And so he was there in that hideout. Have you ever wondered, what did Elijah do there? He was there alone. He had food and drink, but what did he do? Well, I do believe that maybe he was, and I think Pink mentions this in his book, that he was probably very much in communion with God. God was working in his life and preparing him for the next stages that were to come, because there were going to be some very big things for him to do. He was alone with God. God often does that, doesn't he? He often takes a person alone and spends time with them. It's interesting when you read through the Bible, actually, how many people had this sort of wilderness experience. Remember Moses? The time he spent as a shepherd before his great work began, before the burning bush. He spent a lot of time out there on his own. Was God working with him there? And what about John the Baptist? He spent time in the wilderness. Jesus did. Paul did also. Do we seek to be alone with God? Do we make it our aim to find some time, even in a busy world, to be with him? It's important. Do you keep up your quiet time? If you miss out on it, do you try to make it up at some other time? Or maybe in your holiday time? It is that important to be alone with the Lord. I believe that God was doing many great things with him here. But then there was a predicament, wasn't there? Everything seemed to be going well. Maybe Elijah was even quite content being there. He was out of the limelight. He didn't have to face that king. It might have even become quite comfortable. After all, he was getting meals on wings. He had the water there. Didn't have to do his shopping or anything or cooking. He was there with God. Maybe he was having a wonderful time. But it wasn't to remain that way. Do you remember when Peter was up on the Mount of Transfiguration with Jesus and the other two disciples? He said it's good for us to be there, and he wanted to almost settle there. He was going to make booths for them all, and they were going to stay up there on that mountain. It was wonderful. But they had work to do down in the valley. And Elijah, likewise, was going to have to be moved on. So we have Elijah's predicament. Being a hero of God does not make us immune to the ordinary everyday problems and troubles. Verse 7 says, after a while, the brook dried up. Because there was no rain in the land. Well, it was inevitable, wasn't it? Maybe God has supernaturally held it from drying up for a while, but there came that time when it dried up. Elijah had been comfortable, secure, and at rest, safe. But now he was going to be moved on again. There was work to do. God moves Elijah on. And sometimes he will use natural means to do it. Maybe you've experienced something of that in your life. Perhaps, in a sense, a brook has dried up. A place where you were comfortable, or a job you had, or a situation. And you feel that God is forcing you out. And he will often use very natural, ordinary means to move you on. It's good too because it reminds us that we don't rely on anything. Maybe Elijah was in danger of relying on the brook and the comfort and the security he had in that seclusion. God moves him on. Perhaps you felt that. Maybe you're going through a situation and you feel everything was going well, and suddenly the brook dries up. Maybe finance, or it may be job situation, and you feel just like Elijah. Well, it could be that God is moving you on for a purpose. He has something better for you. Now, this might not have seemed the way here for Elijah, but he had work to do, didn't he? There was a poor widow that needed help. Isn't it amazing that God kept this man in these extraordinary ways? He feeds him with ravens, and then there's a poor widow who's about to give up, and he uses her. He could have got someone rich and famous to come along and help Elijah, but he chooses a widow woman. Everything seemed to be going wrong, and then another situation comes. A new situation occurs, and so Elijah is moved on. Well, we're going to leave the story of Elijah there, but I would invite you to read through the story of Elijah. There are many good books that look at his life in detail. It is a wonderful story. Yes, in some senses it's extraordinary, but as I said earlier, it's not so much about the extraordinary feats of Elijah. It's more about the extraordinary feats of the God of Elijah. Now, we live in a godless world, don't we? But we're called like Elijah to stand against the flow, whatever. Like that man called in Ezekiel 22:30 to stand in the gap. God has a specific role for each one of us that no one else can do. And it's our duty to make sure we find out what that is and we do it faithfully. It may not be a public, upfront job. It may be just simply doing the job that you've been called in this church. Do it well. That's your calling. And for each one, it will be different. So what about you? What's your role in life, in church, in the wider locality, amongst your family? Remember that Elijah's God is our God. It's the same God, isn't it? He hasn't changed. And we should have the same high expectations. And there is no power, whether it's intellectual, civil, social, cultural, political, that is going to get the better of God, because he is your God. And he is if you truly believe in him and know him as your God. What about Elijah's example of holiness? It's not stated specifically here, is it? But it's implied. How could God work through a man who was not truly holy? Elijah had a walk with God. And I like that expression because walking is something we can all understand. I'm sure at times you've been on some lovely walk with a friend or member of a family, and it's so natural, isn't it? You're walking and you're talking and you're sharing and you're enjoying the journey as you walk along. And that's a picture that's often given to us of God's people who are truly close to him. Abraham walked with God. But specifically, can you remember that lovely story where we hear of Enoch walking with God? And Enoch shares quite a lot in common with Elijah because neither of them saw death. And it's a mysterious thing where in the picture of Enoch, he just walks with God and he walks with God and he walks with God, and it seems like he walks into heaven. God takes him. And later on, this happened to Elijah. He was especially chosen. But it was his life that was important, the way he lived his life. And the challenge is for us. Do we really walk with God? Or is it more like an occasional moving in and out of that relationship? We get taken up with so many other things in our lives. To walk with God on a regular basis, day after day. And you know, people think that it was easy for Enoch. It was primitive times, there were no distractions. But he had a big family. He was the head of his family, and there were many wicked people around him. It wasn't easy for him. There were distractions, and yet he walked with God, and so should we, all of us. That is the way to closeness with God. That is the way to holiness, because you can't walk close with God and have sin in your life. So the challenge is for all of us to walk with God. God may well send some great people who will be like the Elijahs, but our job is to be faithful and to walk with God in holiness and to pray for such days to come.